Game changer? It's a question today. More specifically, what if? What if the 2024 presidential campaign cycle isn't actually going to be fought on the ground that we today, right now, think it is? What if the question isn't, are we really going to do this? Are we going to maybe elect a convicted felon running explicitly on a platform that ends the American experiment in democracy? But on a more basic level, should we be asking a different question, like, is he all right? Watch as the presumptive Republican presidential nominee celebrates a deadly domestic terrorist attack he helped incite on the United States Capitol, as he openly shows contempt for and toward his own supporters standing in front of him, as he rambles on and on and on and on about sharks, of all things, and rants so bizarre that Unhinged doesn't come close to capturing it.
He just came up. Are the teleprompters not working, sir? Not even a little bit. Great job. And then I don't pay the company that does it, right? And then I end up with a story Trump doesn't pay. I don't pay contractors that do a job. And that's a job. That's a job. This is the worst border in the history of the world. There's never been, no third world country has a border like that. And no third, I'll tell you what, and I hope the military revolts at the voting booth. I went to a boat company in South Carolina. The boat, I said, how is it? He said, it's a problem, sir. They want us to make all electric boats. So I said, let me ask you a question. And he said, nobody ever asked this question. And it must be because of MIT, my relationship to MIT. Very smart. He goes, I say, what would happen if the boat sank from its weight and you're in the boat and you have this tremendously powerful battery and the battery's now underwater and there's a shark that's approximately 10 yards over there. By the way, a lot of shark attacks lately. Do you notice that? A lot of shark. I watched some guys justifying it today. Well, they weren't really that angry. They bit off the young lady's leg because of the fact that they were not hungry, but they misunderstood who she was. These people are crazy. He said there's no problem with sharks. They just didn't really understand a young woman swimming now really got decimated, and other people too, a lot of shark attacks. So I said, so there's a shark 10 yards away from the boat, 10 yards, or here. Do I get electrocuted? Do you feel the breeze? Because I don't want anybody going on me. We need every voter. I don't care about you. I just want your vote. I don't care. But those J6 warriors, they were warriors, but they were really more than anything else. They're victims of what happened.
Two things to deal with before we go any further. One, Fox News didn't air that speech. What do they know? I don't know. And two, we're not going to bleep him this year. Shitty is the word that he said. Called his teleprompter shitty, called the contractors shitty. This is what he sounds like today, though. That was him, unfiltered, in his own words, in front of his supporters, as he seeks the White House for a third time. He is, of course, a convicted felon. His Earth 2 worldview completely devoid of facts, untethered to reality. He offers no vision at all, to say nothing of a positive vision for the people who support him. Now, whenever Trump talks, between the ramblings or rantings about sharks or electric vehicles, or he seemed to be talking about electric boats there, if you could track it, or windmills, which he still talks about a lot, toilet flushing, the endless stream of lies about the border. Of course, he's the person who killed the bipartisan border deal, or the rule of law, or the system of justice. It's not just lies and disinformation. They're lies that sit at the fulcrum of the threat of dangerous violent extremism and a dangerous escalation that people will act on the rhetoric and the things he says. Trump calling his most violent supporters, the people who he summoned to Washington, who stormed the United States Capitol, quote, warriors, amounts to what New York Magazine today calls a mask-off moment. They write this, quote, portraying the insurrectionists as innocent victims is an obvious lie. Portraying them as warriors is more honest, but the candor reveals a confidence that is quite chilling. Trump has inspired the development of a paramilitary wing to his movement. He has goaded their aggressive impulses and rewarded their loyalty. And as Trump made clear yesterday, if anything was clear at all, his entire campaign, his entire movement is in service of just one thing, Trump. Biden campaign sought to turn Trump's own words against him in what is likely one of the shortest ads of all time. It was released a few hours ago. Watch.
Because I don't want anybody going on me. We need every voter. I don't care about you. I just want your vote. I don't care.
I'm Joe Biden, and I approve this message.
I think that may be the second mask-off moment of the speech. It's a campaign speech that revealed a Donald Trump more dangerous, more erratic than ever before as he sits today for a virtual meeting with a court-appointed probation officer. It's also where we start today. Former Senator, co-host of MSNBC's How to Win 2024 podcast, Claire McCaskill, is with us. Also joining us, senior advisor to the Lincoln Project and author of The Conspiracy to End America, 5 Ways My Old Party is Driving Our Democracy to Autocracy. I think I called it the first must-read of the cycle. It's fantastic. Stuart Stevens here. And with me at the table for the hour, my friend and colleague, NBC News correspondent Vaughn Hilliard. He was there yesterday to witness history. Vaughn Hilliard, this opening of our show today and the questions I've asked was inspired by your much shorter report on Nightly News that I saw that was unbelievable and included this reporting that you did on Trump supporters there. Let me play that as well, and then I'll turn it over to you.
Would you want him to seek retribution against those who have brought these charges against him?
Of course. They should go to jail. I mean, if you're going to make false accusations, if I made false accusations, I'd be thrown in jail in 2 seconds.
He's not going to get angry. He's got too much to fix. He's not a vengeful person.
He's running as a vengeful person. I mean, you've done an extraordinary body of reporting. It's shaped most of my thinking about where Trumpism is at this moment. But just take me inside what happened yesterday.
They believe, number one, his supporters, these most loyal supporters that are willing to stand out in triple-degree digits for multiple hours under the Las Vegas sun for a noon rally, that Donald Trump is seeking justice, their version of justice, right? You heard the man call for retribution, saying, of course. I mean, we talked for quite a long time, and he said that it started with Barack Obama. Barack Obama should be jailed. Hillary and Bill Clinton should be jailed. Nancy Pelosi should be jailed. Alvin Bragg should be jailed. The list is long, and they believe that would
President
be just.
Obama do?
He was the beginning of this. He began to spy on Donald Trump's 2016 campaign. This is the part of the conspiracy theory that has been created and has only cemented itself in the minds of people over the course of years to build up to this moment that they believe that these individuals should be jailed. And Donald Trump is looking out and speaking knowingly that people are willing to stand there, thousands of them in triple-digit degree heat, for the very reason that they want him back in the White House. And I think that there is one other gentleman that I talked to where I asked him about, retribution, and he told me in response, he said it was election night 2020 when he first realized that the election was stolen. And he told me that I knew something. I was being lied to. I didn't realize my whole life I'd been lied to, and that the news media is all telling us lies. And we've all just been captured. We're programmed. We believe whatever. We've been programmed to believe this our whole lives. They believe, truly, a great number of people, that they have been captured by the news media, by the Democrats, by the right, and Donald Trump is the justice warrior. And that is why they're willing to stand out in triple-degree heat and listen to a speech for more than an hour from Donald J. Trump.
And let's deal with the speech.
The speech itself, the number one thing for me was when he mentioned warriors. It caught my ear because Donald Trump has heralded this message to his supporters that, it was instigated by FBI informants, which of course is not truth, and that these were peaceful protesters. He's repeatedly said that to cast aside the violent images that we all watched unfold on January 6th. But when he referred for the first time there yesterday to the warriors, he's called them patriots in the past, the January 6th defendants who were jailed, many of them pleading guilty, hundreds of them pleading guilty for assaulting police officers and obstructing an official proceeding. When he called them warriors, that's antithetical to peaceful protest. A warrior, the definition of warrior is somebody who is engaged in warfare or conflict. And so by calling them warriors, again, we hit at the word justice in Donald Trump's version of justice, and his supporters. When he calls them warriors, you're giving them a certain level of valor for the actions that were committed that day. And I can tell you there was one January 6th defendant who was released from prison a couple months ago who said hi to us. That was in the crowd there, right? This is a fight for the country that Donald Trump, by giving them that distinction 5 months out, for me, I don't know what ultimately all this leads to here.
Yeah, but go ahead.
No, but warriors is another step outside that even made me perk up.
I mean, but the thing that makes me burst with exasperation, which is all I can muster for Trump these days in that state, will deal with his state. I mean, he couldn't seem to get the word military out. He was ranting and raving about the prompter and then seemed to digress more than he was on a script.
Donald Trump is, you know, he acknowledged the teleprompter wasn't working. I mean, that is what happens when it's 100 degrees. Our phones were dying out there actively. That does happen. Technology doesn't work. Donald Trump, though, has been an unscripted self, an unvarnished self, and that is what this campaign was built to allow here in the year of 2024. That is why people come to listen to him, because he is unvarnished. He is not writing the script, right? And more so than ever, even more than 8 years ago, more than 4 years ago, I think this is Donald Trump in his truest form. And perhaps with age, I don't know what Donald Trump's mental state is, but I can tell you, listening for a speech that goes on for more than an hour, Donald Trump is speaking whatever is on his mind, and there have been no repercussions or consequences. You could say a guilty verdict is a consequence and a potential sentence is a consequence, but politically, if for somebody who may or may not believe that he actually won the 2020 election, he doesn't believe that he has suffered the political consequences yet. And that is what is at stake, and that is what is worth giving a speech, continuing to travel this country to galvanize his supporters for.
I mean, if you think of them as right-wing moles having to sit there festering at the Supreme Court, waiting until they had a big enough majority to do what they were sent to do, and then they finally have the great day when they can do it, and they can let the unlimited dark money flow, and they can take away abortion rights, and they can shut down the Voting Rights Act and do all these great things. And instead of getting cheers for it, they are criticized. They're thin-skinned and they're criticized. But it's almost like, you know, the cicadas have come out after years of just sitting there in the dark. Now they're showing who they really were all along, and there's a lot of resentment wrapped up in all of that.
Hi again, everyone. It's now 5 o'clock in New York. Another day, another reason to have profound and deep fear and doubt in Justice Samuel Alito's ability to be fair and impartial on the United States Supreme Court. That was Senator Whitehouse's theory of the case. We now have a new instance where Alito reveals himself. It has to do with new undercover audio recorded last week by a progressive activist named Lauren Windsor at the Supreme Court Historical Society's annual dinner, an event we told you about here before it happened. Windsor is known to coax candid comments out of Republican figures by misrepresenting herself as one of their allies. What you're about to hear is a portion of her recording. Windsor, playing the part of a religious conservative, speaks to Justice Samuel Alito about our nation's ideological tensions. Listen.
Know that we can negotiate with the left in the way that needs to happen for the polarization to end. I think that it's a matter of winning.
I think you're probably right. I think one side or the other is going to win. I don't know. I mean, there can be a way of working, a way of living together peacefully, but it's difficult, because there are differences on fundamental things that really can't be compromised. So it's not like we're going to split the difference.
Spoiler alert, it's not like you can split the difference. Alito, in his own words, about whether or not the right and the left can ever, quote, live together or work together, quote, peacefully. This is a part in the program where we are obligated to tell you that as a network, we reached out to Justice Alito, as well as to press officers at the United States Supreme Court, to see if they wanted to respond to Justice Alito, in his own words, on tape, saying those things. You can't, quote, split the difference. We haven't received any comment yet. If we do, while we're on the air, we'll bring it to you right away. But again, another extraordinary development in the entire history of the United States Supreme Court. Justice Alito, caught on tape, is where we start the hour with some of our most favorite reporters and friends. Senior correspondent at Vox, author of The Agenda, How a Republican Supreme Court is Reshaping America, Ian Millhiser is back, plus senior editor for Slate and host of the Amicus podcast, Dahlia Lithwick, is back. With me at the table, MSNBC legal analyst Christy Greenberg's here. Dahlia, it gives me no pleasure to say this, but if the country is educated, I say this as someone who spent my career in Republican politics, if the country is made aware of the extremism and radicalism of 2 of the members and families of the United States Supreme Court, 2 of 9 members, it will be thanks to liberal activists like Lauren Windsor and investigative journalists like those at ProPublica. What an extraordinary new piece of information and revealing comments, in his own words, on tape from Samuel Alito.
I think it's fair to say, and I know you didn't mean it this way, but I will accept the criticism that, you know, the Supreme Court dedicated press corps has a little bit been on screen save on this story for a very long time. We've known a lot of things were a little hinky, and I think most of us just felt like it was our job to report the cases and not the conduct. So, you know, thankfully, what surged into the void was, as you said, you know, Politico and ProPublica and the New York Times and now Lauren Windsor, who are saying, you know, the conduct is not just shocking and unconscionable and should be covered, but, and this is important, I think it's what Senator Whitehouse was getting at in the promo, it's intrinsically connected to the cases that we cover. It is intrinsically connected to the doctrine that they produce, because these are justices who in their private lives, day after day, show that they're in the tank for one side.
It was not intended as a criticism, more a celebration of I guess your analysis, though, is a little sharper than mine, Dahlia, so we'll go with it. We'll adopt it around here. I'm just so grateful. And listen, no one in this conversation has more culpability than me. I worked in the White House that appointed Samuel Alito. My theory, and it was why I was pressing Senator Whitehouse on this, my theory is that there's a chip on you know, Alito's shoulder the size of petite little Harriet Miers, because he was Bush's second choice afterward. But something else has happened. I mean, he's completely radicalized. He's not stupid, so that's not the right theory. He's an intelligent man who's so deep in a view that even in right-left politics, traditionally, it isn't represented on the main stage or the spectrum. I mean, just talk about his articulation of godliness.
I mean, in some sense, look, godliness, the sort of comment to Lauren Windsor is a sort of reflection of much larger themes that are not surprises to us. You can't read the Dobbs opinion and not know how he thinks about godliness. You can't read the text of the speech he gave in Rome right after Dobbs and not know how he thinks about godliness. And lest there were any remaining doubt, the flag, the Appeal to Heaven flag that flew for months at his beach house suggests exactly how he feels about godliness. So, you know, props to Lauren Windsor for getting it in his own mouth, but none of this is a surprise. And I just want to note, we have 2 major abortion cases that are pending that will come down in the next 3 weeks, in which at least one person has very, very, very strong feelings about godliness that will inflect on how that case gets decided.
I mean, 2 abortion cases. Yeah, Christy, and immunity. And I think if this is the other half of how we are to interpret the things he said during oral arguments, we should all buckle up.
We should absolutely buckle up. I mean, to me, this wasn't so shocking because following that oral argument on presidential immunity, Justice Alito's comments in particular were striking because he talked about the fact that, you know, these prosecutors are going to come after, you know, the former president who should be resting in his retirement. And instead, you're going to have a bitter political opponent sending his prosecutor off, destabilizing democracy. I mean, it was wild. And, you know, it was very clear where he was going. I think what we should absolutely do is buckle up for a very strong opinion here. But he was clearly forecasting that he is just in the tank for Trump, and he is going to write an opinion that gets to his desired result. I mean, when you hear those kinds of comments where he's talking about, you know, the lack of compromise, and you don't need to compromise because one side has to win, and there are fundamental differences, and somebody's got to win. I mean, this is a far cry from what we heard back in confirmation hearings about judicial philosophy of textualism and originalism. That's what we used to hear. And now, like, this is what he really means. It's about winning, because he has a larger view, and that is godliness. And that is what is going to be, you know, reflected in his actual opinions. Everything else was just window dressing for what he really thinks and believes. And I think that is incredibly troubling.
And what is it that we should be prepared for on immunity?
I mean, You wouldn't expect them to say absolute immunity because you would think that would be crazy. But then again, this is also crazy.
Right.
I've always thought that we will get a majority opinion, and maybe again Alito dissents because he is just that extreme, but some majority opinion that will have this kicked to Judge Chutkan and saying, oh, well, there's some outer perimeter, there is some immunity for some acts, she has to go back and go through the facts. And again, that accomplishes what they actually want to accomplish,
right, which is delay.
Yeah. So that this doesn't happen before the election.
Ian, I didn't mean to put Dahlia on the spot. I appreciate how candid she was. I did the same thing in the last hour on the Trump story, and so I'll try to do it in the same way. Are we asking the wrong questions? I mean, and I'll take all of you out. Like, are we asking the wrong questions? I mean, is he too extreme to be on the Supreme Court? Is the Senate Judiciary Committee, which is controlled by Democrats, are they too convinced of their own lack of power and tools? I mean, what is happening where we're going like this? I mean, nobody thinks this is good, and nobody thinks there's anything that can be done.
Yeah, I mean, I think there has been an awakening amongst the American public to just how much of a problem the Supreme Court has become. You know, I echo both of my colleagues who said this isn't a surprise. You know, if you are shocked by the stuff that Alito said on this tape, wait till you read his opinion in Obergefell v. Hodges, his dissent, thankfully, where he said that one of the reasons why we can't extend equal marriage rights to gay couples is because if we did, then someone might call a conservative Christian a bigot. You know, wait till you read his opinion in Stormins v. Weissman, where he said that if you live in a town where the only pharmacist is a conservative Christian who doesn't like birth control, I guess you don't get to get your birth control because that person's rights trump yours. So, you know, one thing that has been consistent in Alito's jurisprudence, you know, that line that he had in the tape about how one side is going to win or the other side is going to win, is if there is the slightest inconvenience for his side, you know, if someone might say a nasty word about his side, he has argued that that's a reason to take, you know, fundamental rights away from other people. And I guess the reason why we're seeing so much attention on this, because Alito's been saying it in his opinions for so long, is after Dobbs and after so many outrages from the Supreme Court, the public is just really focused on the fact that, oh, wait, these guys are a problem.
Of course, there is no convicted felon like Trump. He's one of a kind. So all I can speak to is how it goes for the average Joe. And what happens is that they are asked to come into the probation office, which in this case is at 100 Center Street in Manhattan, and sit in a small city office, meet with a civil service probation officer, and discuss everything from the crime that they are convicted of, any criminal history they may have, their family situation, their obligations, where they're living, how they're supporting themselves, their income.
So unlike any other convicted felon in New York City, Donald Trump will not have to go into 100 Center Street, and he will have his lawyer, Todd Blanche, sitting next to him for his pre-sentencing meeting with the probation officer happening today. Trump will reportedly call in for the interview from the comfort of his own home at Mar-a-Lago, the site of where he's accused of mishandling classified documents. But like any other convicted felon in New York City, Trump will have to answer truthfully and with his own fate in the balance after 4 years in prison at stake. Joining our conversation, former SDNY Criminal Division Deputy Chief, MSNBC legal analyst Christy Greenberg joins us. Vaughn, Claire, and Stuart Stevens are all back with us. Take me inside how this is likely to go on the official side. You know, will any of the sort of sails be trimmed in terms of the questions asked and the kind of answers pursued?
So I think they'll cover the normal topics that they would cover: your background, your medical history, mental health, financials, which should be an interesting part of the report. And then they'll ask questions about the offense conduct. It'll be interesting to see whether he really engages and how much he speaks to that, if at all, because he's not, obviously he's disputing and the facts that came out of the trial and is claiming he's innocent. But it does make sense to me. I'm not surprised at all that Todd Blanche is participating in this. I mean, you saw what happens when there's no teleprompter. You know, he will go off the rails. And so wanting to make sure his client doesn't get himself into any deeper legal jeopardy, he's there to make sure that he stays on message, which their attempt in this interview is really try and paint the most, glowing picture you can of the former president and why this probation officer should not recommend a sentence of jail. And so that is their objective here. Whether they will be successful remains to be seen.
When you're convicted of a crime, how does it work if you're not remorseful for committing the crime and sorry to the victims of the crime?
Yeah, so, most defendants that go to trial and are maintaining that they're innocent are unlikely to show remorse. And that doesn't necessarily count against you, but you certainly can get credit if you plead guilty and do accept responsibility. But I don't expect the judge will say, this is somebody who exercised his right to a trial and is still maintaining his innocence, and I'm going to hold that against him. But he has plenty of other things to hold against him, right? 10 gag order violations. Gag order violations since the verdict. You have gag order violations from the last trial where he was attacking the law clerk. So one of the things the probation officer has to look at is this somebody who's amenable to supervision? Is this somebody who will follow the rules? He is plainly not. And so that is one of the many reasons I think this probation officer should be recommending a jail sentence.
What does the probation officer and then the judge do about someone whose position on the prosecutor is that Alvin Bragg should go to jail?
Right. How do you say that this is somebody who's going to have respect for the law? That one of the things you're trying to do with any sentence is promote respect for the law. He has none. As Claire McCaskill said brilliantly, just a few seconds ago, he's somebody who's saying screw you to all the institutions, including the rule of law. So I don't see how this is somebody that you can say is going to follow a probation officer's words. He doesn't follow the court orders. He has thumbed his nose at the system in every which way. So again, one more reason why there should be a jail sentence here.
What about the idea that they're likely to argue that his service to the country as his president, his crime was committed in the Oval?
Yeah. That's an aggravating. They're going to argue it's a mitigating factor, right? Look at his service to this country, which is laughable considering he's talking about, I don't care about my own voters at a rally. Like, the only person whose interests Donald Trump cares about are his own. He doesn't care about anybody else. But I think that it is an aggravating factor that he is signing the checks, those falsified business records from the Oval Office. That makes it a more serious offense, not less of one. And I think the fact that they're going to argue, look, he's potentially the future president of the United States. And so really you would destabilize this country if you put him in jail. That is an argument you've heard a lot of people making. But it is far more stabilizing if the American presidency becomes a get-out-of-jail-free card. And you can have somebody who does not accept responsibility and who is thumbing their nose at our democratic institutions just say, OK, well, I'm president, so I don't get jail time. That cannot be how it works.
That is how it has worked for Trump so far. That everyone that investigated him had they didn't just get the disrespect that he's shown Bragg and Merchan, Andy McCabe, Pete Strzok, Jim. What they did, and we covered them all for their individual narratives, but what they did in Trump's view was they dared to investigate his 2016 campaign's ties to Russia. He is never, ever able to acknowledge a mistake.
I don't think you ever hear the words "I'm sorry" or "regret," and I don't think that Donald Trump even, when we talk about the January 6th Select Committee, you also have not only the chance to say that I made a mistake, or he just doesn't even ignore it. Just last week, he called for the indictment of each of the members of Congress who were on the January 6th Select Committee.
Adam Kinzinger.
Right. That is still the committee ended its work, a year and a half ago, and yet that is still clearly at the forefront of his mind for reasons I don't know at any given moment why it is at the forefront of his mind. But Donald Trump has called for the jailing of Alvin Bragg, citizen's arrest of Judge Engoron, of Letitia James, the New York Attorney General. You've got to go into the archives, but he's pretty much called for the arrest of most of his, not political enemies, perceived political enemies, and those who have investigated him or dared to question whether he committed unlawful acts.